Okay, we're
Great.
on.
All right, thanks, Tom. So I'm Richard Hague with the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition Story Gathering Project. And our guest today is Thomas Cuni. Tom, can you say your full name and where you live right now?
It's Thomas Lee Cuni, and my last name is spelled C-U-N-I. I currently live in Cincinnati at the Bedford. It's a condominium, and it's where I am now. I'm sort of retired.
Oh, excellent. All right. Yeah, I know about that sort of retired business.
Yeah, it's a long list of sort of, I should have do a whole lot less. So,
Exactly, yes. So Tom, where were you born and raised up?
I was born in Logan County, West Virginia, which is in the southern part of the state. It's in the coal fields. And I grew up there until I left at age 17. I actually to go to college in Cincinnati, and I actually lived in a town called Man, M-A-N, which at the time I was growing up had 1,200 people, and it now has 800 as the coal fields have played out, population leaving the county. And so that's where I'm from.
Do you still have people in Logan County?
No, I have friends there, high school friends. Facebook has made a surprising change. I probably more than 10 years ago, I wrote a little memoriam on Facebook of all places for a high school teacher that we had, and a couple of people saw it, and I wound up getting contacted by way of Facebook by several hundred people. Wow. From that area, many of them high school and school age friends, but a lot, the brothers and sisters of my sister's friends, or just the people I grew up with in that small town. And it's been interesting to reconnect after all these years with the people that I knew for the first 17 years of my life.
That's a great story. Was the high school a city high school, or was it a consolidated school?
It's a consolidated school. There were in Logan County, there were fundamentally three different high schools. Man was one district, and then Logan at the county seat had a high school, and then Chapmansville, which was on the other side of the county, had a high school. And those were the three high schools for the entire county.
Yeah, yeah. Now that teacher that you wrote the memorial for must have been somewhat influential, given.
Oh, tremendous. She was Betty Chappell was the thing I remember the most about her. Now, this was in the 1960s, so you have to get the historical context of it. She was the sponsor of the National Honor Society at the high school, among other things. A biology teacher who was fun and made biology fun, but her work there, most schools you got into the National Honor Society just by scoring on the National Honor Society test or whatever test it was and grades that made the difference. We had a little bit of a different interview process. The interview was with Betty Chappell, and the hurdle that had to be overcome was this. There were both black and white students in the Honor Society. And I'll loop back on why we had such an integrated school, but nevertheless, there were. And in order for you to qualify, you had to agree, and not only did you have to agree, but your parents had to agree that the monthly meetings that took place in the homes of students would be attended, and by all students. So if you were white, you would have black students, and for many people, that was the first time that a black person had come in their home on a social basis, and then vice versa. You had to go to a black student's home if the meeting was there. And that was in 62, 63. So it doesn't seem like much now, but it was just just an extraordinary set of examples that she set out for us on how to live our life. But that was Betty, and everybody remembers her fondly and remembers that aspect of her of how she mentored us. So
Fabulous story. You were going to loop back on the presence of African Americans in Logan
If you
County.
if you met our Board of Education back in the 50s, you wouldn't think too much of their educational level, I'm sure, or their intellectual accomplishment. But they did one thing right. After Brown versus the Board of Education, they decided that they weren't going to fight it. Now, in other counties, Raleigh County with Beckley and other places did and delayed integration. But the Logan County Board of Education simply wouldn't tell anybody what they planned to do over the summer. And I think it was probably 57, maybe 58, but right after the board decision was final, that they announced a week before school was to begin that the colored, as it was called, colored school system was closed and the schools were thoroughly integrated. There was no time for any reaction or outraged meetings. It just, and we had Black teachers who transferred also. I can't tell you the statistics on that, but I would say that the high school I went to with 220 in my graduating class probably was close to 20% Black. And I had several Black teachers. James Haygood is one I remember with great fondness, and just a different time. Now, I don't want to paint it that there was no racial prejudice. There certainly was, but the proximity to each other in the small town, I think, paved the way for the integration of our schools a lot more easily than in, for instance, urban schools. So.
Marvelous, wonderful story. What did you do before you left? What in the summers and as a boy and young man? What were your things that you did?
Well, I've written about this and I've said if I had let my boys do what my father let me do, I probably would have to spend some time in the local jail. But again, different time, different place. The man is in a river valley, mountains all around. It would not be unusual when we wanted to go camping for my dad to take me and a couple of my friends, throw all our camping gear in the truck, a pickup truck, and drive up some disused gas well road or mine road, and drop us off on, say, a Thursday and say, boys, I'll be back here on Saturday, 2 days from now, noon, sun's highest in the air, meet me here. And that would by itself not be, I think, not be very strange, except we were 10 years old or 11 years old. But then add that we all had our single shot 22 rifles with us and off we went into the woods. I can't imagine that being the case now, that you give a gun to an 11-year-old and turn them loose. But they did. And we did. So I grew up, that was kind of the flavor for what it was. We could ride long distances being, I don't know, 10, 15 miles on bikes. This is all in the valleys that you run through. Everybody lived in the valley, in the river and creek valleys. And that's what we did. Now, I worked my daddy lost his job with Guy and Eagle Coal Company when it sold out in the late 50s. And he and another fella bought a couple of grocery stores, and real grocery stores, they're not supermarkets. And I worked in those from that time forward. And then before that, I had a paper route, and working was always a big thing, both with my family and I think there was a pretty strong work ethic throughout that area. It was poor. I didn't know how poor until I got to Cincinnati at 17. And I realized if I was in the middle class, I was on one of the first rungs of the middle class. But nevertheless, I led a life that a lot of it was outdoors. I was an avid reader, so I read a lot too. But that was my life, and I enjoyed it. I had friendships that have bridged over the decades from that, although we're now getting a little thinner in terms of numbers. But it was just small town living at its best.
Yeah. Beautiful. How long had your family been in Logan County or in Appalachia in general?
Um, the two sides. I'll start with my dad's side first.
Yeah.
Now, I wound up back in Cincinnati because it is the closest city. And I went to the University of Cincinnati because I'd grown up in a small town, and there's two things about small towns. The one really good thing, everybody knows you, and one really bad thing, everybody knows you and everything about you. And I really was anxious to live in an urban area. So Cincinnati was my choice because it was proximity, but also, and this was just a byproduct, not necessarily a driver. My father's family was from Covington, Kentucky. His father, back in the early part of the 20th century, traveled down to West Virginia, as did many people, because that coal fields were opening up and there was opportunity. And that's what he did. And so he came down from Covington, Kentucky to West Virginia and wound up being a store manager for one of the coal companies. And that's how they got there.
Okay.
My mother's side of the family, much more, I would call, embedded in Appalachia. My grandmother, Polly, and I'll just tell, as you can tell, I tell stories. In 1969, I'd been drafted. I had finished college. I'd been drafted, gone ahead and signed up in the Army, and I had 30 days before I left. And so I was doing my farewell tour. I drove down to Bluefield, where my grandmother lived, Polly lived, after they sold the farm. My grandfather had been a coal miner, had his back broken in one accident, had both his legs broken in another, decided farming was a far better way to survive than coal mining. And so they bought a little tiny farm that I spent many times, many trips there. Well, anyway, 69, I arrived at Polly's house in Bluefield. And my grandmother never passed up an opportunity to have free labor go wasted. So she had me in the backyard tying up a fruit tree. I think it was an apple tree that had been an overabundance, and it had split. And what she wanted me to do and what I did was you put a little clay where the split was, then you kind of haul it up, block and tackle, until you put it back together again and then tie it up real firmly. So it, in theory, the branch will stay alive until the fruit's ready to harvest. But in any event, I was doing that. And while I was doing it, of course, everybody was out in the backyard talking to me. And there was a radio on the porch that we were listening to. Well, Polly was in her 80s by this point and was a lot more comfortable talking about her early days. And that day she was talking about coming up from North Carolina with her dad. And she was how proud she was as a little girl to be riding a saddle horse up. They brought the sawmill up. Her father, my great grandfather Jarrett, had a little sawmill, and he came to the coal fields in West Virginia to cut mine timbers. And so she was talking about that and the trip north and what it was all about. And it was an interesting story and a wonderful story. But now back to the radio on the porch. It was Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. So I've always remembered that day as this juxtaposition between my grandmother's time growing up in the in the country, literally, and in another century, and closer actually to people that lived thousands of years ago than they were to the time. What a life she had. But that was it. My grandfather was like many other people, like my dad's partner in the store. His mother had health issues, and he was given to a neighbor to raise. And the Atkinson name is really not a biological name, but it's our name. It's our family name because he grew up as an Atkinson. And just like Lauren Burks grew up as, or was an Altizer, but grew up as a Burks. We're seeing that more and more nowadays, but that was a very common kind of circumstance where I grew up, Dick. And in any event, we were a coal mining family. My mom used to pack my granddad, her dad's lunch to go in the mines, she and her sisters. And when I was earning my way through college and I had mining jobs, she'd pack my lunch. It smoothed the way for me because I had the best lunch on the crew every day. People were nice to me, even if they didn't like me, because I had better food. But in any event, that's my touch. And when I talk about Appalachia, those years I worked with in mining jobs were tremendous. And in my dad's store, I delivered groceries. I delivered, driving pickups up and down the hollow and off the hard road, as we called it.
Mhm.
And so I just enjoyed the experience, and I got to know a lot of people well. And relatively speaking, I mean, we were better off than most, but it's just all relative to say that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Did you use the term Appalachian or Appalachian or mountain
No,
people in your
no,
family? No.
hillbilly. In
Oh,
fact,
okay.
man, that was, we were the Manhigh Hillbillies, so we called ourselves hillbillies.
That was the official name for
That
the school
was
team.
right.
Okay, great. Oh, wonderful. Oh man, we could go on and on. We've got a few more minutes. I know that you could talk for maybe 2 or 3 days, but
Yeah,
uh,
no, at
how
least
about,
that.
yeah, how about 2 or 3 more minutes just on whatever?
All right.
Thanks.
Do you have any other questions, or would you just want me to?
No, yeah, go ahead and say what you would like to say that you haven't said, and what it was like growing up, and what any legacy that you feel that you've brought.
Yeah. Well, you and I both belong to an organization, the Writers Club, that writes. And I grew up in a culture where storytelling, if you haven't figured it out by now, everything I talk about is by way of a story, was it. And it's given me a lifelong interest in that. And of all places, Facebook, where I can write these little articles, about little recollections, I call them, about growing up in West Virginia,
Yeah.
has a real resonance. In fact, in a lot of things I write, the comments are more interesting than what I wrote. And and it just stirs the memories of what it was like when we were growing up. And I talked about the lunch buckets that we had to carry as minors, and that it started a whole thing. Oh, my dad didn't like the water up here, and he went up Rock House to get just everything like that.
Mhm.
That people remember. And I remember that it's a time and a place that is kind of frozen. I go back there mostly for funerals, but occasionally a reunion or something.
Yeah.
But and I still have friends who live there. And it's like the town is, from the outside, is kind of frozen in time, at
Mhm.
least in my memory. And it's changed very little from when I grew up. It's just a lot fewer people, but that hasn't really changed the character of it. The one last thing that I will say about it was, and we're talking about getting to know the people. When I got to Cincinnati, I was really surprised that they still had the place where you locked up people here. What was it? I can't remember the insane
Yeah,
Longview.
long,
Longview High.
right.
Well, we didn't have Longview. We couldn't afford that kind of stuff. So we had a town chock-a-block full of people that really should have been, cared for in other ways, if you had the institutions, or would have been cared for, not should have been.
Mhm.
But the Sawmill sisters, Ed and Elle, the two crazy brothers, the Chick, Andy Belcher, Andy Trent, these people walked the streets and were accepted as part of the community with all the eccentricities and obvious issues that they had. And I never thought a thing about it. And you get here, and it's a very different approach to mental health. And when I look back on that, I thought, you know what, we're probably a lot ahead of our time when we in mainstreaming people with issues.
Yeah.
But that, some people would probably say I belonged with that in that group I just described. That's my record.
Yes. We had our street people too in Steubenville, Bible Bill and Doggy Daddy.
Right.
Doggy Daddy would walk into the meat shop where I worked as a clerk as a high school kid, and he'd get into the middle of the gaggle of women standing in front of the meat cases, and he'd start to bark.
Well, Elle used to stand at there's a one-lane bridge over into the residential part of Man, and he couldn't help himself. Every now and then he would go stand there when the good ladies would be stopping to wait to get onto the bridge. He would expose himself. And now, we had one policeman, but that wasn't who you called. You called his brother Ed, who would come with and carrying a switch and running back up the creek, switching him, telling him, I told you not to do that. Similar to what you do. But he thought a thing about it. I mean, you'd be in Cincinnati.
These are great stories, and it's true. We didn't put these people away. We just kind of lived with them and enjoyed in a way the variety of characters that we saw. Huh? It was great. Tom, this has been fabulous, and I hope that we can do it again. We're only the recording time is limited by the account that we have as far as uploading it. So maybe we'll get back to you sometime. But I just want to say how much we all appreciate your stories and your being here and being an urban Appalachian with the rest of us here in Cincinnati. Thanks so much, and take care.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.